When we picture medieval prisons, it's easy to imagine dark stone dungeons filled with chains and shadows. But what happened when the prisoner was a woman? The reality was stranger, harsher, and often more humiliating than we might expect. From petty accusations that spiraled into confinement to bizarre punishments designed for public spectacle, female prisoners experienced a justice system that blurred the line between law and control. Some endured hunger, disease, or abuse behind bars. Others found themselves locked away in castle chambers, silenced with iron, or forced into ordeals that defied reason. Their stories were rarely written down, but they reveal a hidden world where survival itself was a daily act of resistance. The arrest nobody wanted. A woman's path into a medieval prison often began not with a proven crime, but with an accusation loud enough to be believed. In a world where gossip and suspicion carried the weight of law, reputations could collapse overnight. In 1313, court rolls from Essex recorded Alice Attet-Woad accused of stealing a loaf of bread. No witness testified, and no loaf was recovered. Yet Alice was hauled before the manorial court and placed in custody until her relatives could raise surety. The record reflects a system less concerned with fairness than with preserving order. Crimes were judged not by harm, but by disruption to community balance. For women, accusations frequently overlapped with expectations of obedience. A Norwich case in 1321 described a woman charged with raising discord after she quarreled with her husband in the marketplace. There was no mention of injury or damage, but her refusal to remain silent was treated as a civic threat. She was confined in the town jail until she apologized and paid a fine. The record shows that prison often functioned not as punishment for proven offenses, but as correction for behavior deemed improper. Religious courts expanded the risks further. In 1378, Marjorie de Belton was confined in the bishop's prison at Ely for loose living. A vague phrase covering adultery, prostitution, or simply defying moral expectations. Ecclesiastical courts prosecuted everything from blasphemy to failure to attend Mass, and women bore the brunt of these moral charges. Punishment often involved imprisonment until a ritual of public penance was performed. Registers describe women walking barefoot through churchyards with candles in hand before they were released. Humiliating displays meant to restore moral order. Theft accusations dominated legal roles, though evidence was rarely required. In 1293, a woman named Agnes was arrested at the Yorkshire Assizes after a neighbor claimed she had taken a pot of ale. The sheriff's roll contained no mention of a recovered pot, yet Agnes spent 3 months in jail awaiting trial. She was acquitted, but her lost time in custody and the stain on her reputation endured. For poorer women, acquittal brought little relief. To have been imprisoned at all left a mark that could not be erased. Marital conflicts often spilled into civic courts. In London, in 1357, Joan Atgate was committed to prison after her husband complained that she refused his governance. The mayor's court released her, but the case highlights how disobedience within marriage could be treated as a civic offense. York records from 1369 describe another woman jailed for defiance of her spouse. Imprisonment in such cases enforced patriarchal authority, serving more as domestic leverage than as genuine justice. Political upheavals brought harsher consequences. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, women were swept up alongside men. Lists of prisoners held in the Tower of London include 4 women from Southwark, one accused of hiding weapons, another of inciting men to riot. Their inclusion demonstrates that women were not always passive victims. They were seen as participants in rebellion and punished accordingly. Rumors of women encouraging unrest were enough to justify confinement by royal command. Even trivial disputes could lead to imprisonment. In 1342, the Wakefield Manor Rolls recorded Alice of Holmfirth accused of allowing her geese to trample crops. Rather than imposing a fine, officials confined her in the manor's prison until her husband paid compensation. Here, prison served not as punishment, but as a tool of pressure, forcing families to settle debts and restore village harmony. The process of arrest itself lacked consistency. Warrants were rarely issued, investigations were uneven, and sheriffs or bailiffs acted quickly on complaints from neighbors or husbands. Wealth could shield the accused, as money allowed pledges and sureties to secure release. Poorer women, however, sat in cells for weeks or months awaiting hearings. Time itself became punishment, regardless of outcome. The surviving records depict not a system of justice weighing guilt and innocence, but one where accusation and punishment blurred together. Women were confined for theft, defiance, loose morals, or even the antics of their livestock. Some were swept into prisons by politics, others by domestic quarrels or gossip, whispered in the wrong ear. For medieval women, prison was not the end of a trial, but often the beginning, a blunt instrument of order imposed by husbands, neighbors, or priests. Shackles, but make it fashion. Once a woman was seized in medieval Europe, the matter of how to restrain her became immediate. Courts and towns had no shortage of devices designed to immobilize the accused. Shackles, chains, and stocks served not only to prevent escape, but also to broadcast disgrace. For female prisoners, the restraints often carried meanings beyond custody, turning their confinement into a public lesson about obedience and shame. One of the most common restraints was the fetter, a heavy iron ring fastened around the ankles and joined by a short chain. Surviving sets from the Tower of London show how these devices were made deliberately cumbersome, forcing short steps and constant noise. For women, who were less likely than men to stage violent breakouts, the fetter was often unnecessary as security but effective as humiliation. Chronicles note prisoners led through markets with their chains clattering, their slowed pace turning the walk itself into a spectacle of subjugation. Manacles inflicted a similar burden on the hands. Archaeological finds from York and Lincoln reveal hinged iron cuffs that snapped shut over the wrists. When applied to women, the practical effect was more than restraint, it stripped them of independence in daily life. Records from Norwich describe women marched to jail with hands locked in irons, forced to rely on guards even for eating or basic hygiene. The dependency itself was part of the punishment, a constant reminder that an accused woman was under control in every sense. Stocks offered a more public form of discipline. Set up in town squares, these wooden frames immobilized the arms or legs of the offender. In Coventry in 1352, 3 women suspected of cloth theft were locked into stocks for hours. Crowds gathered, children mocked them, and refuse was thrown as they sat exposed. The discomfort was real, but the greater penalty lay in public scorn. For women, whose reputations carried heavy social weight, such scenes inflicted damage long after their release from custody. By the later Middle Ages, authorities developed devices aimed specifically at women accused of disruptive speech. The scold's bridle, first documented in Scotland in the 15th century, consisted of an iron framework that enclosed the head and included a plate pressing down on the tongue. Though appearing somewhat later than many restraints, it illustrates the medieval impulse to control women verbally as well as physically. A woman fitted with such a bridle could be paraded silently through town, the forced quiet becoming a spectacle of enforced obedience. Other restraints relied on rope or wooden posts. Women accused of market fraud or selling spoiled food might be tied near the very stalls where they had traded. These punishments blurred custody with theater, staging justice in front of the same customers who had once purchased from the accused. The shame of being bound in a familiar setting amplified the lesson, turning everyday places into temporary arenas of judgment. Inside prisons, restraints remained a routine part of custody. Accounts from London jails list expenditures for collars, chains, and locks applied to inmates, women included. Some prisoners were fixed to walls in narrow cells, unable to move more than a few steps. Others wore iron collars attached to chains that forced them to remain seated or prone. The constant friction caused sores and lasting marks, physical traces of imprisonment that followed women even after freedom. Unlike men, who might be admired for endurance, women were often mocked for weakness, their struggles cited as evidence of guilt rather than hardship. Transfers between prisons, or from court to jail, were also staged as ritual. Prisoners were often marched through city gates in irons, a deliberate display of authority. For officials, the spectacle reinforced civic order. For the women subjected to it, every clinking step was a reminder that their bodies were being used as symbols of discipline. The restraints turned private accusations into public statements, branding women with shame visible to all. Restraints in medieval justice were never just functional. They were symbols that transformed accused women into cautionary figures. Fetters, manacles, and stocks prevented escape, but they also stripped dignity and reinforced dependence. The sight of a woman hobbled in iron or fixed in stocks was intended to deter others as much as to punish her. In a culture deeply invested in hierarchy and control, shackles became both tools and messages, binding not only the body but also the reputation of those forced to wear them. Castles and confinement. The popular image of a medieval prison often suggests torchlit dungeons beneath looming fortresses, but the truth was far less uniform. Across Europe, there was no standardized prison system, and women were confined wherever space could be spared. Castles, manor houses, and civic halls all doubled as makeshift jails, and the location of confinement depended more on circumstance than on the crime itself. A woman accused of theft might end up in the same room once used to store grain, while another, suspected of treason, could find herself in a guarded upper chamber. For noble women, imprisonment could feel like an extension of domestic life, though one stripped of freedom. Records from Edward II's reign describe women of rank confined in furnished chambers rather than dungeons. Margaret de Clare, suspected of aiding her rebellious husband in 1322, was placed under guard in a castle chamber. She was allowed bedding and meals from the Lord's kitchen, yet denied visitors or correspondence. The surroundings were far more comfortable than a cellar, but the restriction of movement and communication underscored the reality that even the privileged could be reduced to captives when loyalty faltered. For women of lesser means, the picture was far bleaker. Castle cellars, towers, and storerooms were often repurposed into cells. Archaeological surveys at Norwich Castle show narrow stone rooms with almost no light or ventilation, their floors worn by years of use. 14th century accounts describe straw tossed on damp floors and chains bolted into walls. These spaces were never intended for long stays, yet women could languish for weeks or months while courts debated their cases. Comfort was never a priority. Containment was all that mattered. Towns with no dedicated prisons relied on improvisation. Spare storerooms, stables, or even pigsties became holding places. A complaint from Lincoln in 1347 records women confined in filthy sheds unfit for Christians, a phrase that captured both the squalor of the structures and the indifference shown to the accused. Though temporary, such confinement left lasting humiliation, especially when the whole community knew where the women had been kept. Geography shaped outcomes dramatically. In London, an accused woman might be sent to Newgate, the city's most infamous prison, where overcrowding, disease, and noise were constant. By contrast, a rural manor might keep only 1 or 2 women in custody at a time, isolated in a damp cellar, but still neglected. The unevenness of conditions shows how justice looked vastly different depending on where the arrest occurred. Even within a single castle, experiences varied. Some cells were little more than cupboards beneath staircases, while others were full chambers divided into sections. At Lancaster Castle, records from the 15th century describe women's rooms reserved for female inmates. Despite the label, these spaces were crude. Prisoners slept on straw, endured cold stone walls, and survived on meager rations. Such inconsistency reflected the fact that medieval imprisonment was improvised rather than systematized. Noblewomen occasionally pushed back against restrictions. Letters from Eleanor de Bohun, confined during early 14th century disputes, complain of being denied her servants and of inadequate clothing. Her appeals suggest that even women spared the filth of dungeons, felt the psychological weight of confinement. Privilege could soften the material conditions, but could not erase the isolation or loss of agency. For poorer women, no such petitions were possible. Once locked in a cellar or tower, survival depended entirely on the whim of the jailer. Food might be irregular, bedding non-existent, and privacy impossible. Accounts from Durham describe women bolted into pitch-dark rooms, vermin crawling freely. Such details remind us that confinement was often less about justice than about expedience. Authorities simply needed somewhere to store the accused until judgment. This patchwork system reveals that medieval prisons were not designed as permanent institutions. Instead, they served as temporary containers, holding women until fines were paid, penance performed, or verdicts delivered. Whether lodged in a guarded chamber or a rat-infested cellar, the message was the same. Once accused, a woman's body no longer belonged to her, but to the authority that confined her. In a society obsessed with order, imprisonment was less about where she was kept than about proving she could be kept at all. The Medieval Dungeon, Women's Edition. When most people imagine a medieval prison, their minds drift immediately to the dungeon. a cavernous chamber beneath a castle, damp stone walls dripping with water, and flickering torchlight barely illuminating the gloom. While not every woman accused of crime or disorder ended up in such a place, dungeons did exist. And when women were confined within them, the experience could be both physically destructive and symbolically charged. To spend time underground was to be buried alive by authority, a living reminder of society's power to strip away dignity and light. The architecture of dungeons varied widely. Some were natural caves adapted into holding areas, while others were purpose-built chambers beneath keeps or towers. They were almost always cold, wet, and poorly ventilated. At Rochester Castle, surviving accounts describe women kept in a stone vault with one narrow slit for air, a description echoed in chronicles from other English fortresses. Archaeologists at Chillon Castle in Switzerland have uncovered dungeon floors still marked with iron rings once used to fasten chains. For men, such surroundings suggested toughness endured. For women, the dungeon environment often carried an added layer of humiliation, as their suffering was meant to reinforce lessons about obedience and submission. Conditions inside were grim. Straw might be scattered for bedding, but it quickly became foul with dampness, vermin, and waste. Prisoners sometimes shared space with rats, lice, and insects that thrived in the darkness. The absence of natural light disoriented captives, and descriptions from clerical visitors note that women left such cells pale, gaunt, and weakened. One record from 14th century York recounts a woman accused of theft who was drawn forth from the vault near death, a phrase suggesting that confinement itself was intended to wear prisoners down before trial. Food was another form of control. Jail accounts reveal that women in dungeons often received only coarse bread and weak ale, barely enough for survival. In some cases, meals were tied directly to the payment of fees. Without relatives or friends providing money, a woman might go hungry. Chroniclers in Paris wrote of women begging through dungeon grates for scraps from passers-by. Hunger and darkness combined to make imprisonment not just a loss of freedom, but a slow assault on the body. The dungeon also served as theater. When authorities wished to make an example, prisoners could be displayed at the threshold, dragged into daylight to show their condition before being thrust back inside. Such moments reminded onlookers that the dungeon existed, a space of punishment beyond ordinary comprehension. For women, this kind of spectacle could blur the line between justice and cruelty, as their disheveled appearance became part of the lesson for the community. Not all women endured solitary cells. Records suggest that in crowded jails, dungeons might hold several inmates at once, with no divisions for privacy. Women accused of petty theft might find themselves chained alongside those accused of treason or heresy. The mingling of crimes and the lack of regard for female modesty revealed how little thought was given to distinctions once a body was cast into the underground. Shared confinement amplified humiliation, stripping away personal boundaries in ways considered especially degrading for women. Occasionally, dungeon confinement was used as a punishment in itself rather than a holding measure. In German cities, women accused of prostitution or blasphemy might be locked underground for a fixed number of days, released only after they performed public penance. Such use of the dungeon emphasized its symbolic weight. It was not just a place to wait, but a punishment meant to crush spirit and body alike. Still, some records suggest that even dungeons were not always escape-proof. Chronicles mention women attempting desperate flights, bribing guards, or digging at mortar with broken tools. Few succeeded, but the stories reveal resilience amid despair. They also remind us that confinement, however harsh, never fully extinguished the human desire for freedom. In the end, the dungeon was less about architecture than about meaning. To consign a woman to the depths of a castle was to declare her removed from ordinary life, placed beyond sight and comfort. The physical darkness mirrored her legal invisibility. Until judgment came, she existed only as a problem to be contained. For medieval society, the dungeon dramatized authority's power to bury dissent. For the women forced to endure it, the memory of cold stone and endless night could last long after freedom returned. A diet of gruel and desperation. Once a woman passed from the shock of arrest and the humiliation of restraint into the daily routine of imprisonment, her survival depended on food. Medieval prisons were never designed to sustain life comfortably. Instead, they offered meager rations that reflected both the poverty of the institutions and the assumption that prisoners deserved little beyond the bare minimum. For female inmates, Hunger was not only common but deliberately used as part of their punishment. The official allowance in many English prisons was simple: bread and ale. At Newgate, 14th century accounts recorded a loaf and a gallon of small ale per day. In practice, this provision was unreliable. Jailers frequently kept portions to sell, reducing prisoners' shares to crumbs. Women without families to supply food often went hungry, since authorities assumed that kin or neighbors would bear the cost. When support failed, starvation followed quickly. Reports from Norwich in 1375 describe women lying in misery for want of sustenance, dependent on bystanders who tossed scraps through the grates. Such scenes show how food was never guaranteed. For the poor, prison meant an immediate struggle to survive on less than subsistence. Bread might be stale, ale sour, and portions deliberately cut short to remind captives of their dependence. Quality mattered as much as quantity. Moldy bread, thin pottage, or foul peas appeared often in records. A complaint from Lincoln in 1359 states that women were forced to eat peas full of worms. Noble women sometimes lodged formal protests. Eleanor de Beauharnais, confined during a political quarrel, wrote bitterly that the beer is weak and the meat unfit. Her status allowed her voice to be heard, but peasants endured silently. The food they received marked their social position as much as their confinement. Class differences shaped the prison diet. Wealthier families might send servants or arrange for deliveries, turning confinement into something closer to enforced seclusion with tolerable meals. For the poor, meals were left to chance. A woman with no relatives nearby could find herself begging through iron bars. The inequality was stark. One prisoner might dine on decent bread and salted fish, while another, in the same jail, gnawed moldy crusts. Inside prisons, food created a shadow economy. Women bartered bread for clothing or ale for a place on the shared bedding. Some struck deals with guards, offering favors in exchange for better meals. Though rarely mentioned openly, scattered notes in jail accounts hint at these desperate trades. Survival depended not only on endurance but on negotiation. Hunger also became a tool of discipline. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes ordered women kept on bread and water until they confessed or agreed to penance. Records from Ely mention prisoners denied food until they promised to perform public acts of repentance, such as walking barefoot through a churchyard. In such cases, deprivation was not neglect, but policy. A way to bend bodies and wills. Monastic prisons occasionally offered more consistent food. At Durham, records list portions of bread and fish given to female inmates from the priory kitchens, though these distributions often coincided with religious feasts. For the rest of the year, even church-run prisons kept diets thin. Charity was no guarantee of nutrition, only a reminder that survival relied on the goodwill of outsiders. Deaths from starvation, though not always carefully recorded, did occur. In 1316, a coroner in Kent noted a woman jailed for theft who died of want of food. No official was punished. Her death was treated as the natural result of poverty and guilt. Such cases reveal the indifference of authorities, for whom a prisoner's death by hunger resolved the problem without further expense. Across records and chronicles, food emerges as the thread that tied prison life together. The daily loaf, the watery ale, the occasional handful of peas, all carried meanings beyond nutrition. They measured a woman's status, reflected her family's support, and revealed the priorities of the authorities. Hunger was punishment, neglect, and warning, all at once. For women, imprisonment was not only about stone walls or chains. It was about the constant ache in the stomach, the fight to secure another crust, and the knowledge that survival rested on others' mercy. Meals were never routine. They were precarious, uncertain, and always insufficient. The medieval prison diet left women weakened long before any official sentence was carried out, making hunger itself one of the harshest punishments they endured. Cleanliness denied. Cleanliness is often the first thing stripped away in prison, and in the medieval world, its absence shaped every detail of daily life. For women confined in castles, civic jails, or improvised sheds, filth was not just unpleasant, but dangerous. Without washing, without privacy, and without fresh clothing, imprisonment turned into a slow erosion of dignity. While men suffered the same squalor, female prisoners endured additional layers of humiliation, since ideals of modesty clashed with the constant reality of dirt. Bathing in medieval society was already uneven. Nobles enjoyed private bathhouses, and monasteries maintained communal baths. But for ordinary people, washing was limited to basins or streams. Prison stripped even these meager routines away. A woman locked in a stone cell might go weeks without access to water beyond what she drank. Records from York Castle mention prisoners begging for buckets to cleanse themselves of filth, requests often ignored. Dirt and lice spread quickly, turning confinement into a battle against decay. Clothing worsened the hardship. Prisoners wore whatever garments they had at arrest. For wealthier women, this might mean a linen gown, but without laundering, even fine fabric rotted on the body. Accounts from London in the 14th century describe women dragged before court in rags of stench and soil, their garments stiff with grime. Poorer women, who owned little, often ended up in tatters, shivering in the cold. Clothing became another reminder that imprisonment ate away not only freedom but appearance, stripping women of social respect. Waste was managed badly, if at all. Some jails provided chamber pots, but many cells forced prisoners to relieve themselves in corners. Chronicles from Durham describe pools of foulness soaking cell floors. For female inmates, humiliation multiplied. The lack of privacy meant relieving themselves in sight of guards. Such indignity could be exploited as intimidation, with filth used to break down resistance. Dirt became not just an environment, but a weapon. Disease thrived in this neglect. Lice, fleas, and the constant damp-bred dysentery and fevers. Women, often weakened by poor diets or pregnancy, suffered the most. In 1363, London records mention 2 women dying from flux of the belly within days of each other. Almost certainly dysentery, contracted in filthy cells. Death by dirt was common enough to be expected. The prison itself became executioner, sparing courts the trouble of sentencing. Some noblewomen tried to resist these conditions. Eleanor de Bohun, already vocal about her rations, petitioned for soap and access to baths during confinement. Her requests highlight that cleanliness was treated as a privilege, not a right. A woman with wealth or connections might secure water, servants, or fresh linen. The rest endured filth until release or death. Dirt thus became another measure of status, with poverty guaranteeing the harshest experience. Public punishments deepened the association of dirt with dishonor. A woman placed in the stocks could be smeared with mud or pelted with garbage. Her immobility made her both prisoner and spectacle, transforming filth into public theater. To be dirty in the marketplace was to be disgraced, the body marked with shame as surely as with chains. Monastic prisons sometimes softened conditions but never erased the punitive element. At Ely, records describe nuns confined for disobedience receiving straw for bedding and buckets of water, replaced on feast days. Even here, cleanliness was part of discipline granted, withheld, or rationed, depending on obedience. Hygiene remained a tool of control, never a guarantee. The denial of cleanliness carried spiritual meaning as well. Medieval theology tied dirt to sin, purity to holiness. Chroniclers often described filthy prisoners as outwardly displaying their inner corruption. A woman caked in grime was not merely unfortunate but visibly guilty. Her body turned into evidence. Dirt thus reinforced the moral message: she belonged behind bars. To live in medieval confinement was to lose the fragile routines that preserved dignity. Without washing, without clean clothes, and without privacy, women became symbols of disorder, their bodies marked by lice, sores, and stench. Cleanliness denied was punishment in itself, stripping away humanity layer by layer. For female prisoners, the absence of soap and water was not a trivial discomfort, but a profound assault on identity, leaving scars that lasted long after the cell door closed. The jailer's kingdom. If prison was a kingdom, the jailer reigned supreme. Women who passed through medieval jails quickly learned that their fates were tied less to distant judges than to the men and sometimes women who held the keys. Jailers fed them, chained them, and decided how much daylight or darkness reached their cells. They stood at the blurry line between official justice and personal whim, turning confinement into a daily negotiation of survival. The position of jailer was not a glamorous post. In many towns, it was little more than a civic duty handed to someone who lived near the jail. In larger castles or cities, it was an official appointment, sometimes purchased as a source of income. Jailers earned fees by charging prisoners for food, bedding, and even access to chains. The poorer the prisoner, the harsher the treatment, since inability to pay often meant subsisting on scraps and sleeping on bare stone. For women, whose financial independence was already limited, jailers became gatekeepers of both body and dignity. Abuse was common. Records from 14th century London mention women complaining of beatings, theft of clothing, and deliberate starvation at the hands of jailers. Because prisoners were socially suspect, few outside cared. One complaint from York describes a woman whose child was born in a dungeon. The midwife delayed because the jailer demanded extra payment before opening the door. Such stories reveal how confinement was shaped as much by corruption as by law. Yet not all jailers were monsters. Some acted as protectors in a system designed to neglect. A letter from 1372 mentions a jailer at Canterbury who allowed a woman accused of theft to remain with her nursing infant, providing extra milk at his own expense. In Durham, a jailer intervened when townsfolk pelted women in the stocks, shielding them until order was restored. These acts of mercy were exceptions, but they remind us that jailers occupied a complicated position, both oppressors and sometimes unlikely allies. Female jailers occasionally appear in records, though rarely. In households where the jail was attached to the keeper's residence, the jailer's wife often managed female prisoners. She might guard, feed, or supervise them, creating an intimate but still unequal relationship. A Durham roll from 1365 names Alice, wife of the jailer, as responsible for watching female inmates. While less brutal than male overseers, such arrangements still reinforce the absolute dependency of prisoners on those who controlled their bodies. Sexual exploitation was an unspoken reality. Chronicles hint at women coerced into submission by jailers who knew complaints would go unheard. An entry from the London coroner's rolls mentions a woman who died in custody after dishonor by her keeper, a euphemism that speaks volumes. For vulnerable women, the jailer's key symbolized not just confinement, but power over their very bodies. Survival often depended on compliance, silence, or luck. The economic side of jail keeping cannot be ignored. Jailers made money not by salaries but by extracting fees. Bread, straw, chains, and even air were commodities. A woman unable to pay might find her chains heavier, her meals smaller, her bedding removed. Wealthier prisoners could purchase privileges, access to courtyards, better rooms, or visits from family. Justice thus turned into a marketplace, with the jailer as merchant. Religion added another dimension. Jailers were expected to ensure prisoners attended confession or mass, but compliance varied. Some facilitated priests' visits, others blocked them unless bribed. For women, whose spiritual reputation was often questioned, denial of access to confession reinforced the stigma of sin. The jailer's choices shaped not only physical survival, but also eternal salvation. The jailer's authority extended to spectacle. When women were paraded in chains or placed in stocks, it was often the jailer who prepared them, fastening irons and leading processions. Their humiliation was stage-managed by the keeper of keys. In this sense, jailers became agents of civic theater, turning punishment into public drama. Living under such authority meant that a prisoner's world shrank to the will of a single figure. The sheriff or judge might pronounce the sentence, but the jailer carried it out daily. For women, already limited by law and custom, this dependency cut especially deep. Every meal, every visit, every chance of comfort passed through the hands of a keeper who decided how harshly the cell would feel. The medieval jailer's kingdom was not grand or glorious. It was a realm of keys, chains, straw, and silence, where mercy or cruelty shifted with personal whim. For women locked inside, the jailer was both captor and lifeline, master of the shadows where justice blurred into survival. Justice on display. Medieval justice was rarely private. For women accused of crimes, punishment often unfolded under the gaze of neighbors, strangers, and townsfolk who gathered for the spectacle. Cells and dungeons might confine the accused out of sight, but when justice demanded correction, authorities turned to the marketplace, the churchyard, or the village green. Here, humiliation was as important as restraint, and women's bodies became canvases on which order was reasserted. The pillory and stocks were staples of public punishment. In both England and France, town records describe women locked into wooden frames while crowds jeered. A case from Coventry in 1352 notes 3 women accused of cloth theft, bound in the stocks for a day, pelted with refuse until their clothes were unrecognizable. The punishment was as much about public degradation as deterrence. For women, who were judged not only by honesty but also by modesty, the exposure magnified shame. Neighbors' stares and insults carried long after the sentence ended. Markets provided the perfect stage. Because many offenses involved trade-cheating weights, spoiled goods, dishonest bargains, authorities returned punishment to the very sites of alleged crimes. Women accused of selling watered ale might be tied to posts beside taverns, forced to endure the laughter of patrons. Those suspected of gossip or scolding could be dragged to fountains, dunked in cages, or paraded around the square. Each punishment doubled as warning. Justice did not hide, but announced itself loudly. Punishment by water carried symbolic force. In some towns, cucking stools punished women accused of disorderly speech. Seated in a chair fixed to a lever, they were dunked repeatedly in rivers or ponds. Accounts from Chester describe crowds gathering to watch as women were plunged, their garments clinging to them in humiliation. The punishment targeted both the body and the voice, turning female speech into a public offense corrected through water and mockery. Clothing, or the lack of it, also became a tool of display. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes ordered women to walk barefoot in penitential processions, carrying candles through churchyards. The act marked them as sinners before God and neighbors alike. More humiliating still were orders to appear in shift or undergarment only, stripping away both protection and modesty. Records from Eli mention women made to process half-dressed, their shame intended to serve as a moral lesson for others. Executions, though rarer for women than for men, drew immense crowds when they occurred. Women convicted of serious crimes such as treason or murder were often burned rather than hanged, the fire intended both as punishment and as cleansing. Chronicles describe the spectacle of flames consuming women before assembled townsfolk, who interpreted the event as both justice and theater. The burning of Marjorie Germain, accused of witchcraft in 15th-century London, illustrates how female transgression became spectacle, where death itself was staged as civic ritual. Even minor sentences relied on visibility. A woman fined for market cheating might be required to sit at the stall with the spoiled goods displayed beside her, an advertisement of guilt. The offense was made inseparable from her identity. Shame became currency, traded for community reassurance that order had been restored. Authorities understood that public punishment relied on audience participation. Crowds were encouraged to mock, jeer, or throw filth. The community, not merely officials, enforced correction. For women, the damage often extended far beyond the punishment itself. A stint in the pillory or dunking in a river lingered in gossip for years, branding reputations with stains no acquittal could wash away. Religion reinforced these displays. Priests preached sermons alongside punishments, reminding onlookers that earthly justice mirrored divine will. A woman's humiliation became evidence of sin, her suffering a public moral lesson. Punishment blurred into preaching, with the female body serving as scripture. To be punished in public was to be remade in the eyes of the community. Dungeons might strip privacy, but markets and squares stripped identity, turning women into symbols of disorder corrected. Justice on display was theater of control, where shame and spectacle bound society together. For women, each blow of ridicule or bucket of water left marks invisible but lasting, binding them to memories of crowds that never forgot. The witch in the cell. By the later Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft brought women into prisons under circumstances darker than almost any other charge. While widespread witch hunts belong more to the 16th and 17th centuries, the foundations were laid centuries earlier. Medieval prisons, already harsh, became staging grounds for suspicion of sorcery, where women accused of unnatural powers endured confinement that mixed fear of crime with fear of the supernatural. The first step was often rumor. A woman skilled with herbs, living alone, or simply disliked by neighbors could attract charges. Records from 1324 in Kilkenny, Ireland, detail the imprisonment of Alice Keidler, accused of sorcery, heresy, and consorting with demons. Though her wealth and noble connections allowed her eventual escape, her maid Petronilla de Meath was less fortunate. Petronilla was imprisoned, tortured, and burned at the stake. Her cell the first step toward execution. Their story illustrates how suspicion of witchcraft pushed women into prisons, not for what they had done, but for what people feared they represented. Cells held accused witches in conditions no different from thieves or debtors, but the atmosphere carried added weight. A woman labeled a witch was seen as contaminated, dangerous even to share space with. Accounts from German and French towns in the 14th century describe female prisoners accused of sorcery kept in isolation, their food delivered through grates and guards forbidden from speaking with them. The cell became not just punishment, but quarantine against supposed spiritual contagion. Confession was the key goal. Prison became the holding chamber where interrogations unfolded, often under duress. Ecclesiastical courts believed sorcery to be linked with heresy, and church officials used prisons to extract admissions. Surviving registers from Avignon show women kept for weeks before being brought to questioning sessions where threats of further confinement, and sometimes physical torment, pressed them to confess. Prison thus blurred into torture chamber, even when formal torture devices were absent. Fear of witchcraft bled into how guards and communities treated female inmates. Chronicles mention women accused of sorcery denied visitors, cut off from family support that might have eased survival. In one case, from Toulouse, in 1350, a woman charged with maleficium was forbidden to see her daughter, authorities fearing collusion in dark arts. These restrictions left accused witches isolated, with no advocates to speak for them, intensifying the psychological weight of confinement. Not every accusation ended in fire or rope, but even acquittal did not erase the damage. A woman imprisoned under suspicion of witchcraft carried the stain of rumor long after release. Manorial rolls from Essex note, a woman cleared of charges but later shunned in markets, her neighbors still whispering of her strange potions. Prison served as proof in the public imagination, regardless of outcome. To be confined was to be half convicted already. The association between women, prisons, and witchcraft also reflected broader anxieties about female independence. Midwives, widows, and healers stood at particular risk. Their knowledge of childbirth or herbs set them apart in communities where female roles were expected to remain narrow. Once accused, imprisonment reinforced their difference, casting them as outsiders locked away for the safety of the group. The cell became both literal and symbolic boundary, dividing acceptable womanhood from dangerous deviation. Occasionally, noble women faced witchcraft charges when political rivalries sharpened. The English chronicler Thomas Walsingham records the imprisonment of Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, accused in 1441 of seeking prophecies of the king's death. Though technically beyond the strict medieval period, her case illustrates continuity. A powerful woman accused of sorcery, stripped of influence through confinement. Noble rank offered no shield when whispers of witchcraft spread. Prisons thus became crucibles, where fear of the supernatural fused with the machinery of justice. For ordinary thieves, a cell meant waiting for trial or fine. For accused witches, it meant waiting for interrogation, confession, or execution. The stones of the dungeon echoed not only with chains, but with the fears of communities projecting anxiety onto female prisoners. Each woman locked away as a suspected witch carried the weight of neighbors' terrors. Her body turned into a site where invisible forces were thought to dwell. The witch in the cell was more than an inmate. She embodied everything that unsettled medieval order: unexplained illness, failed harvests, disobedience, or female autonomy. Prison contained her body, but it could not contain the fears projected onto her. For the women trapped under this charge, confinement marked the beginning of a process that rarely ended in freedom, their cells haunted not by spirits, but by the imagination of the world outside. Noble women behind bars. When noble women were imprisoned in medieval times, their confinement carried a weight that went beyond walls and chains. Unlike peasant women, whose incarceration was often invisible to history, the detentions of elite women left behind letters, chronicles, and petitions. These sources show a strange paradox. Privilege softened their captivity, but their fall from power made their humiliation sharper. To be locked away was to be reminded that rank itself could be stripped, and that royal displeasure reached even into a castle chamber. House arrest was the most common form of noble confinement. A queen or countess was unlikely to be shoved into a filthy dungeon. Instead, she might be restricted to a set of rooms inside a castle or manor. Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most famous example, spent 15 years under guard after rebelling against her husband, King Henry II. She lived in relative comfort, attended by servants, yet she was cut off from her lands, her children, and her influence. Chronicles describe her as watched closely, her visitors screened, her letters intercepted. It was a golden cage, but a cage nonetheless. Comfort, however, did not erase the sting of loss. For women raised to wield authority, confinement stripped away the very thing that defined them: access to power. Margaret of Anjou, captured during the Wars of the Roses, endured years in custody in England. Though treated with the deference due a queen, she was still a bargaining chip in dynastic struggle, her movements dictated by her captors. When ransomed back to France, she returned diminished, her authority hollowed by years of enforced silence. Materially, noblewomen often fared far better than commoners. They received adequate food, bedding, and clothes, sometimes even luxuries befitting their rank. A countless gown sent to imprisoned countesses, or wine delivered to noble captives. But these comforts served a political purpose. They reminded onlookers that rank endured even in disgrace. To starve or degrade, a noble woman risked scandal, while maintaining her dignity under guard reinforced the majesty of authority. Her captivity was thus staged as both punishment and performance, balancing severity with decorum. Yet noble prisoners were not always spared harshness. Isabella Macduff, who crowned Robert the Bruce King of Scots in 1306, was captured by the English and confined in a cage, exposed to public view, at Berwick Castle. Chroniclers describe her suspended in the elements, a warning against rebellion. Though she was of high birth, her punishment was crafted for spectacle. Her suffering turned into a political lesson. In such cases, nobility offered no shield when kings sought vengeance. Relationships with jailers shaped daily life. Noble women might petition for more attendance, better clothes, or permission to correspond. Surviving letters reveal constant negotiations, as women appealed to allies outside the walls to ease their lot. These petitions remind us that while their bodies were confined, their voices continued to press against the bars, seeking influence even in captivity. Some, like Eleanor de Bohun in the early 14th century, wrote repeated complaints about the treatment of their servants, highlighting how closely status and self-image were tied to the ability to command. Captivity also carried symbolic weight for wider society. When a noblewoman was locked away, her absence sent ripples through the political landscape. A duchess barred from her estates meant lands administered by others, alliances broken, and loyalties tested. Confinement became a weapon, depriving not just the woman but her entire network of its leader. Chronicles record the shock when queens or countesses vanished from court, their silence louder than speeches. Religion added another dimension. Some noblewomen turned to piety in captivity, framing their imprisonment as a test of faith. Letters describe prayers, donations, or the founding of chapels upon release, acts that recast political defeat as spiritual trial. Others struggled bitterly, resenting the walls that defined their days. The dual lens of sanctity and shame accompanied their imprisonment, shaping how posterity remembered them. In the end, the imprisonment of noblewomen in the medieval world underscored the fragility of privilege. Castles could be both palaces and prisons. Attendants could become guards. Though their cells were often gilded compared to the filth endured by common women, the loss of agency cut just as deep. To be born noble was to live in the glare of politics. And when fortunes shifted, that glare illuminated chains as easily as crowns. For the women who once ruled households, courts, or even kingdoms, imprisonment was not just the denial of freedom, it was the public unmaking of power itself. Debtors and domestic rebels. Not every woman confined in a medieval prison was accused of theft or heresy. Many found themselves behind bars for reasons that seem almost mundane: unpaid debts, broken contracts, or domestic defiance. These women rarely appear in grand chronicles, but manorial court rolls, city records, and petitions offer glimpses into lives interrupted by confinement. Their stories show how imprisonment served less as a response to violent crime and more as a tool for enforcing obedience in matters of economy and household order. Debt was one of the most common pathways into captivity. In a society where credit greased the wheels of trade, failure to repay a loan could land anyone in a cell. Women were not exempt, particularly widows managing estates, or wives left to handle family accounts while husbands traveled. Records from London's sheriff's courts in the 14th century show women imprisoned for sums as small as a few shillings. A brewer might be locked away for unpaid barley, a seamstress for failing to settle with her cloth supplier. The threat of prison ensured compliance, turning confinement into a weapon wielded by creditors. For poorer women, the consequences could be devastating. Without property to offer as collateral, they lacked bargaining power. One petition to the Crown describes a woman jailed in York for an unpaid debt of just 12 pence, held until neighbors scraped together enough to free her. Her confinement served less to secure repayment than to pressure her community into assuming the burden. In this way, prison became an extension of economic discipline, punishing not only the individual, but also those tied to her by family or neighborhood ties. Domestic conflict could also spill into prison walls. Patriarchal law assumed that a husband's authority extended over his household, and challenges to that authority could be cast as rebellion. Records from civic courts describe wives imprisoned after quarrels escalated beyond the threshold of proper obedience. In 1357, for example, Joan at Gate of London was confined after her husband complained she refused his lawful governance. No crime was alleged beyond disobedience, yet the city jail received her as readily as if she were a thief. For women, the prison cell could thus function as an extension of marital discipline. In some cases, women used the threat of prison against one another. Records from Bristol in the 15th century show disputes between mistresses and female servants, where accusations of theft or insolence landed young women in confinement. The imbalance of power within households meant that prison reinforced hierarchies already present in domestic service. What began as a quarrel over chores or wages could end with a servant locked away, her reputation damaged beyond repair. At times, the line between debt and domestic rebellion blurred. A husband might accuse his wife of squandering household goods or failing to account for market sales, framing marital conflict as financial misconduct. Courts, eager to preserve household order, often sided with the man. Thus, the economic and domestic spheres converged in the cell, binding women not just with iron but with social expectations. Conditions for debtors were no better than for criminals. Accounts from Newgate in London and the Marshalsea in Southwark describe women crammed into the same dank chambers as thieves, their only distinction being the legal reason for their detention. Some prisons demanded payment for food and bedding, trapping debtors in a cruel paradox. Those who could not pay their bills were expected to pay for survival behind bars. Families sometimes sold belongings or begged in the streets to keep imprisoned women alive. The stigma of such imprisonment was lasting. A woman jailed for debt might emerge legally free but socially marked. Neighbors remembered her as unreliable. Employers hesitated to hire her, and suitors recoiled from her damaged reputation. Domestic rebels faced similar scars. To be known as a wife who had defied her husband was to carry suspicion long after release. Even when no conviction followed, the memory of confinement clung stubbornly, reshaping how communities perceived them. Taken together, the experiences of debtors and domestic rebels remind us that medieval prisons were never simply about crime. They were instruments of pressure, tools to enforce payment, obedience, and hierarchy. Women caught in their grasp were often guilty of little more than poverty or defiance, yet their punishment was as real as if they had stolen or killed. For them, the prison was not a place reserved for the dangerous, but a net cast wide enough to capture the inconvenient. When medicine failed, imprisonment in the medieval world was never designed with health in mind. Cells were built to confine, not to heal, and sickness spread quickly wherever people were crammed together in damp, airless spaces. For women, whose social roles already tied them closely to ideas of physical frailty and moral weakness, illness inside the prison cell carried special significance. It became both a lived reality and a cultural metaphor, reinforcing the notion that female bodies were more prone to corruption, both physical and spiritual. Disease was nearly inevitable. Chronicles and prison accounts alike mention fevers, fluxes, and putrid airs rising from overcrowded wards. In Newgate, one of London's most infamous prisons, observers wrote of prisoners suffocating in their own breath. For women, already weakened by malnutrition, menstrual blood loss, or pregnancies interrupted by arrest, such conditions were catastrophic. A woman entering the jail with a minor ailment might find herself close to death within weeks, undone less by crime than by confinement itself. Medical care was scarce. Few prisons employed physicians, and when doctors were called, they often came at the prisoner's own expense. One York record notes a woman named Alice, jailed for debt, who begged the mayor for release after falling ill because she could not afford the surgeon's fee. Without funds, she had little chance of treatment. Wealthier women sometimes managed to bribe guards to fetch medicines or consult healers, but poorer inmates depended on luck or charity. Their survival hinged on whether outsiders considered them worth saving. Religious institutions occasionally stepped into this void. Monastic infirmaries sometimes received sick prisoners, particularly if they were accused of lesser crimes and deemed unlikely to escape. A chronicle from Eli describes nuns tending to female inmates suffering from fever, providing herbs and prayers. Yet these interventions were rare and usually motivated less by concern for the prisoner than by the church's commitment to penitence. Healing was framed as spiritual correction, with illness interpreted as both punishment for sin and an opportunity for repentance. Pregnant women inside prisons faced especially grim odds. Accounts from Norwich and Lincoln mention cases where women gave birth in fetid cells, without midwives or clean bedding. Infants often died within days, while mothers faced infections that few survived. These tragedies underscored the cruelty of imprisonment. The state's demand for order was valued more highly than the preservation of new life. Even when officials allowed laboring women temporary release, they were often returned to prison soon after delivery, their health still fragile. Mental illness, though less explicitly recorded, also haunted these cells. Chroniclers wrote of women driven mad by the darkness and solitude of dungeons, or of those who raved incoherently after months in confinement. Medieval medicine, which viewed madness through the lenses of humors, sin, or demonic influence, rarely distinguished between psychological suffering and moral failing. A woman who broke under the strain of imprisonment was often dismissed as weak-willed or wicked, her decline interpreted as evidence of guilt rather than a plea for compassion. The presence of illness also shaped public perception. When sick women were paraded through streets in chains or stocks, their frailty became part of the spectacle. A coughing, limping prisoner embodied both crime and punishment, offering onlookers a warning not to follow her path. Chroniclers sometimes noted these scenes with a sense of grim satisfaction, presenting sickness as divine confirmation of earthly judgment. In this way, disease was woven into the theater of justice, transforming private suffering into public morality. Yet not every sick woman was left to die. Some communities intervened, if only out of fear of contagion. In 1375, civic leaders in Bristol ordered the release of female prisoners suffering from plague symptoms, lest the infection spread beyond the jail walls. Practical necessity outweighed punishment. Similarly, jail delivery records occasionally list women discharged because they were too feeble to endure confinement. These rare mercies remind us that, even in a system built on harshness, survival sometimes depended on circumstance rather than law. The broader lesson is stark. When medicine failed, or more often, when it was absent, prison itself became the executioner. Women succumbed not to verdicts of guilt, but to fevers, childbirth, starvation, and despair. Their deaths were seldom recorded with detail. At most, a note in a coroner's roll or a marginal scribble in a jail account. To the authorities, one sick woman was easily replaced by another. To us, her story reveals how the boundaries between punishment and neglect blurred until they were indistinguishable. Faith in the darkness. When the cell grew too cold, too damp, or too silent, faith often became the only resource left for women trapped inside medieval prisons. Religion shaped every layer of life in the Middle Ages, and captivity was no exception. Civic and church authorities alike understood confinement as an opportunity for correction, a space where women were expected to repent. For some, faith provided comfort. For others, it only deepened despair by reinforcing guilt and submission. Ecclesiastical courts had wide authority over offenses that touched morality. In England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, bishops oversaw charges such as adultery, slander, heresy, or failing to attend Mass. Women accused of these violations might be sent to bishops' prisons, which were often small chambers attached to cathedrals or monasteries. These cells were not meant to resemble civic jails, but to force penitence. Records from Eli in 1378 describe women confined until they agreed to perform public rituals, like walking barefoot through churchyards or carrying candles before congregations. Prison here was not about waiting for trial, but about waiting for repentance. Inside, many women turned to prayer as their only relief. Some recited psalms or repeated Ave Marias for hours, creating rhythm in otherwise empty days. Rosary beads, if allowed, became both a spiritual tool and a way to mark time. Surviving accounts tell of women who promised pilgrimages or alms in exchange for God's mercy. Agnes of Ely, accused of fornication in the late 14th century, reportedly prayed so fervently that sympathetic jailers petitioned for her pardon. Whether literal or embellished, such stories show how devotion could become a survival strategy. Faith also created bonds between prisoners. Chronicles mention groups of women singing hymns in shared cells, their voices lifting together above the din of a crowded jail. These songs functioned as expressions of belief and as signals of solidarity. To join in singing was to resist despair, reminding each participant that she was not alone. In an environment designed to isolate and punish, communal prayer became an act of endurance. Not every woman found comfort in religion. Confessors sent to visit inmates often focused more on rooting out sin than offering solace. A prisoner who insisted on her innocence could be accused of pride, while one who admitted guilt under pressure simply reinforced the charges. This dynamic left many trapped. To resist confession was risky. To yield meant confirming the accusations. Records describe women expressing frustration at confessors who pressured them repeatedly, turning faith into another form of surveillance. Objects of devotion also appeared in cells. Inventories of seized goods mentioned small crosses, amulets, or relics kept by prisoners. Authorities sometimes dismissed these as superstition, yet women treasured them as protective charms. Such items blurred the line between official doctrine and popular belief. For the women holding them, they were physical reminders that divine help might reach even into the darkness of a dungeon. Stories of miracles circulated widely. Hagiographies recorded holy women enduring confinement with saintly patience, or even escaping through divine aid. The legend of Street, Margaret of Antioch, swallowed by a dragon while imprisoned but released unharmed, resonated strongly with female inmates. Though clearly symbolic, her tale spread across Europe, shaping the way real women understood their suffering. By identifying with saints, prisoners could frame their endurance as part of a larger narrative of salvation. Religion also shaped how women were remembered after captivity. Chroniclers praised those who bore imprisonment humbly, presenting them as examples of piety. Others who resisted confession or died in custody were described as warnings of what happened to unrepentant sinners. Either way, the language of faith ensured that a woman's prison experience became part of a spiritual lesson for her community. For the prisoners themselves, faith was less about legacy than about getting through another day. Whispered prayers, hymn singing, or clutching a small cross allowed them to hold on to some measure of control. Even when faith did not change their situation, it gave structure to suffering and a sense that their pain had meaning. In cells designed to strip them of identity and agency, belief became a way to speak against silence. Religion inside medieval prisons was both weapon and refuge. It justified confinement by framing it as correction, yet it also gave women tools to endure. For many, faith was the only companion left when family, freedom, and dignity had been taken away. Escape, or something like it. Escape from a medieval prison was never simple, yet records show that women attempted it with surprising frequency. Cells were not always heavily guarded, walls were not always thick, and jailers were not always incorruptible. Opportunity, desperation, and cunning sometimes aligned, giving female prisoners a narrow chance at freedom. Few succeeded, but the stories left behind show both the ingenuity of the women who tried and the dangers of failure. One of the simplest forms of escape involved bribery. Jailers were poorly paid, and many were willing to look the other way for a fee. In 1315, a London record notes that 2 women held in Newgate managed to walk free after their families paid the keeper directly. The scheme was discovered weeks later, and the jailer himself was fined. For the women, however, the freedom lasted long enough for them to vanish from the records. This kind of escape was less about stealth than negotiation, relying on corruption in a system already plagued by it. Others relied on disguise. Chronicles from Norwich in the early 14th century tell of a woman who attempted to flee dressed as a washerwoman. She made it as far as the town gate before being recognized by a relative and returned to custody. Disguise offered a glimmer of possibility because towns were crowded and social roles provided cover. But for women, it was risky. Clothing and demeanor could only conceal so much when neighbors knew each other well. Recognition often came before distance could. Tunnels and physical ingenuity occasionally played a role. At Chester Castle in 1348, jail accounts mention repairs made after a woman dug with great effort beneath the wall. The record does not reveal her fate, but the expense of filling the hole suggests she came close to success. Digging required tools and time, which most prisoners lacked, but it demonstrates how, even in harsh conditions, some women tried to bend their surroundings to their will. Family networks sometimes aided escape. Women imprisoned in manorial jails were often housed close to their villages, and relatives could attempt rescues. In Wakefield in 1362, court rolls describe a group of townspeople who broke open a holding shed to free a woman accused of theft. The authorities quickly rearrested her and fined the rescuers. But the attempt highlights how community ties could embolden people to defy legal authority. For poor women especially, family support was the only chance of escape. There were also escapes, less planned than allowed. Some jailers deliberately left doors unsecured or keys within reach, expecting prisoners to flee so they could later extort payments for their return. In 1389, 2 women in York walked out of confinement during the night. When they were recaptured, the jailer claimed negligence, but officials suspected collusion. In such cases, escape functioned as part of a corrupt cycle in which prisoners, guards, and officials all played roles. Even when women managed to flee, freedom was precarious. Runaways faced immediate pursuit, and communities were quick to report them. Escape turned prisoners into fugitives, and the penalties for recapture were severe. Women caught after flight could be placed in heavier irons, deprived of food, or subjected to public humiliation. The message was clear: escape attempts would only worsen their condition. Yet despite the risks, attempts continued. The very fact that so many records note escapes or failed efforts suggests that confinement was not always absolute. Prisons were often improvised spaces, never designed with modern security in mind. Wooden doors rotted, locks could be broken, and guards were distracted. Women noticed these weaknesses, and in moments of desperation, tried to exploit them. Some attempts blurred the line between escape and negotiation. Letters survive from noblewomen confined for political reasons, pleading for transfer or release under lighter conditions. Eleanor de Bohun, in the early 14th century, asked to be allowed to retire to a convent rather than remain in castle custody. While not an escape in the physical sense, such petitions reflect the same impulse, a refusal to accept the walls around them as permanent. Escape in medieval prisons was rarely about dramatic flights under moonlight. More often, it was about bribes, disguises, digging, or simply walking away when a jailer was careless. Success was rare, punishment harsh, but the persistence of attempts shows how confinement never fully extinguished the will to be free. For women facing humiliation, hunger, and despair, the chance to break away, even briefly, was worth the risk. Trials by ordeal. In the medieval imagination, guilt was not always decided by human judgment alone. Courts could turn to God as the ultimate arbiter, asking the divine to reveal truth through ordeals that tested the body and spirit of the accused. Women, like men, were subjected to these trials, though the symbolism often cut differently when applied to female prisoners. To endure an ordeal was to place one's fate in the hands of heaven, but it was also to submit to public rituals that bound law, religion, and spectacle together. The ordeal of hot iron was among the most infamous. A woman accused of theft or sorcery might be ordered to carry a heated bar of iron a set number of paces. Afterward, her hand was bound and left for several days. If the wound healed cleanly, she was declared innocent. If it festered, guilt was assumed. Records from 13th century Germany describe women walking barefoot with glowing metal in their hands, watched by clergy and townspeople alike. The test was as much theater as trial, its outcome depending heavily on the priest who examined the wound. Water offered another stage. The ordeal of cold water demanded that the accused be cast into a river or pond. Floating meant rejection by the pure element, a sign of guilt. Sinking meant innocence. Women suspected of witchcraft were often subjected to this ordeal, though it long predated witch hunts. A chronicle from Bruges in 1280 records a woman accused of poisoning forced into the water, her arms bound. She floated and was condemned. The symbolism was cruelly gendered. Water, often linked with purity and baptism, became a means of rejection and shame when a woman was cast upon it. Less violent but still harrowing was the ordeal of the morsel. A woman might be compelled to swallow a piece of consecrated bread or cheese. If she choked, divine judgment was clear. This was sometimes used for accusations of slander or disputes between women in marketplaces. One record from Lincoln in 1317 describes two women forced to consume bread before witnesses to settle a quarrel over wool. The ordeal turned a simple act of eating into a scene of judgment, where failure carried both ridicule and punishment. For noble women, ordeals could be softened but not avoided. Chronicles of the late 12th century mention a countess accused of conspiring against her husband who submitted to the ordeal of the cross. In this test, the accused and her accuser stood with arms outstretched before a crucifix. Whoever lowered their arms first was judged guilty. Though less physically scarring than fire or water, the strain of standing motionless for hours could be immense. For women, whose bodies were often judged as weaker, such endurance was itself a form of humiliation. Clergy presided over these ordeals, giving them sacred legitimacy. Prayers and masses accompanied the tests, embedding them in the rhythms of religious life. Yet historians note that outcomes were often manipulated. Priests might judge wounds leniently if a woman had strong family support, or harshly if she was already despised. The ordeal, supposedly divine, was in practice a stage for human prejudice. Women at the margins of society, widows, foreigners, healers, were far more likely to be condemned than wealthy matrons or noble daughters. By the 13th century, ordeals began to lose ground, as the Church questioned their reliability. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 forbade clergy from participating, effectively undermining the system. But even after official decline, the memory and practice lingered, especially in rural communities. Women continued to be tested by water or forced to prove innocence through symbolic acts well into the late Middle Ages. For many, ordeal remained a lived reality long after legal reform. To face an ordeal was to be exposed literally and figuratively. Women stood before neighbors, stripped of dignity, their bodies turned into instruments of judgment. Whether through fire that seared the skin, water that rejected the flesh, or food that stuck in the throat, the ordeal dramatized guilt in ways words alone could not. It was not truth that emerged from these rituals, but rather a performance of authority, one that reinforced social hierarchies and gendered expectations. For the women subjected to them, ordeals were less about proving innocence than about surviving shame. A healed hand or a swallowed bite might spare them execution. But the memory of public testing endured. Trials by ordeal reveal not only the harshness of medieval justice, but also the vulnerability of women whose bodies became battlegrounds for law and faith. Punishments worse than prison. Prison was rarely the final chapter in a woman's brush with medieval justice. More often, confinement served as a prelude to something harsher, a holding pattern before punishment was pronounced. For some, release followed quickly, but for others, prison merely prepared the body and spirit for penalties far more degrading than a damp cell or a diet of stale bread. The medieval imagination brimmed with punishments that cut deeply into reputation, family standing, and flesh. For women, these penalties often carried a particular edge, aimed as much at controlling their behavior as at deterring crime. The pillory stood as one of the most visible alternatives to long confinement. A wooden frame clamped around the head and hands, it forced the prisoner into immobility in the heart of a bustling square. Market women accused of cheating with weights, bakers who sold undersized loaves, or wives judged quarrelsome, could all find themselves displayed in this manner. Crowds did not merely gawk, they participated. Rotten vegetables, mud, and worse, were hurled at the immobilized figure, while taunts echoed. For men, pillory might emphasize dishonor, but for women it carried an added layer of sexual vulnerability, as jeers often turned to insults about chastity or fidelity. Floggings and whippings brought pain into sharper focus. In many towns, women convicted of theft or prostitution were stripped to the waist and lashed before their neighbors. The blows cut not only skin but reputation, branding the woman as untrustworthy. Unlike imprisonment, which hid the accused behind walls, whipping forced her body into public view. The very act of punishment became theater, with guards, clerics, and townsfolk all cast as spectators. For a woman, whose modesty was supposed to be her shield, the exposure was often as wounding as the lash itself. Some punishments were meant to silence more than to scar. The scold's bridle, an iron cage fitted over the head with a plate pressing against the tongue, appeared in late medieval Britain to muzzle women accused of gossip or disobedience. While technically a later development, its roots lay in medieval impulses to control female voices. A woman locked into the bridle could neither speak nor eat. reduced to a grotesque parody of obedience. Chronicles describe women marched through streets in these contraptions, mocked for the very speech that had once asserted their independence. Branding also left permanent reminders. Hot irons marked the flesh of women judged repeat offenders, often on the cheek or shoulder. These scars acted as lifelong sentences, visible proof of guilt that no release from prison could erase. A branded woman carried her punishment into every future interaction, denied the chance to start anew. Where men might be branded as thieves or vagrants, women bore marks that branded them as fallen or dangerous, shaping how their communities treated them until death. Exile offered another path. Instead of execution, some women were banished from towns or parishes, ordered never to return. While this may seem merciful compared to the lash, it cut women off from kin, livelihood, and protection. For a widow or unmarried woman, exile could mean near certain poverty or exploitation. Cast out beyond the city walls, she was left to wander, her punishment continuing in every rejection she faced. Execution remained the darkest possibility, and women did not escape it. Hanging was common, though women were occasionally drowned as a more modest alternative to the gallows. Some were burned, particularly when convicted of heresy or sorcery. These deaths were staged as communal events, designed to terrify as much as to eliminate. A woman's body, displayed in flames or on a rope, carried a symbolism that reached beyond her crime, reinforcing the authority of church and state over all who watched. Even lesser punishments carried enduring costs. A stint in the pillory, or a whipping in the marketplace, could echo for years, making it difficult to marry, trade, or find acceptance in a community. Where men sometimes rebuilt reputations through labor or military service, women had fewer routes to redemption. Punishments worse than prison often outlasted their physical pain, embedding themselves in memory and rumor. For female prisoners, the cell was rarely the end. It was the waiting room, the pause before humiliation, pain, or even death. The variety of penalties they faced reveals how medieval justice relied not only on walls and chains, but also on rituals of exposure, violence, and exclusion. These punishments made examples of women's bodies, transforming them into warnings etched in flesh, voice, and reputation. The unexpected survivors. Not every woman who entered a medieval prison emerged broken. Some endured conditions that should have destroyed them: disease, starvation, humiliation, yet survived to rebuild lives that defied expectation. Their stories are fragmentary, scattered across court rolls, chronicles, and letters. But together they reveal a quieter truth. Survival itself could be a form of resistance. The mere act of enduring imprisonment and carrying on afterward marked these women as unexpected survivors in a world eager to erase them. Take the case of Alice Reed of Kent, accused of theft in 1364. Records show she spent nearly 6 months in the county jail awaiting trial, during which time a fever swept through the cells. Dozens died, but Alice lived. When her case was dismissed for lack of evidence, she returned home to find her neighbors wary of her. Yet Alice rebuilt her reputation by serving as a midwife, and within a few years, she was again listed in parish accounts as a respected figure. Her survival demonstrates how women could re-enter society, even after the stain of imprisonment. Other survivors leveraged community ties. Joan Coton of Cambridge was accused in 1382 of harboring rebels during the Peasants' Revolt. She spent weeks in custody but avoided execution, thanks to testimony from fellow townspeople who vouched for her loyalty. The record notes that she resumed managing her late husband's workshop soon after release. Joan's endurance illustrates how social networks could be shields, enabling survival not just of prison, but of the suspicion that followed. For some women, survival meant adaptation rather than reintegration. Marjorie Paston, mentioned in 15th-century correspondence, described a kinswoman who had lain in ward for nearly a year and emerged hardened but determined to safeguard her family's interests. Though her imprisonment is only briefly referenced, the letter suggests she returned with sharper instincts for negotiation and self-protection. Prison had not broken her. It had taught her that endurance could be wielded as strength. Religious faith also provided pathways to survival. Some women reframed their suffering as spiritual trial. Chronicles mention prisoners who emerged from cells with reputations for holiness, claiming visions or divine comfort in darkness. In York, A woman named Agnes was celebrated after release in 1401 for her piety in confinement, and townsfolk later sought her prayers. Whether these accounts reflected genuine belief or strategies for regaining respect, they reveal how women could recast imprisonment as martyrdom, transforming shame into reverence. Survival sometimes meant literal escape. In 1356, records from London note a woman named Isabel who broke out of Newgate with several others by tunneling through a weak section of wall. Unlike her companions, she was never recaptured. The rolls fall silent on her fate, but her absence from later warrants suggests she succeeded in vanishing into the countryside. Isabel's survival came not through endurance within the system, but by outwitting it entirely. Her story stands as a reminder that survival could be active defiance. Economic ingenuity also aided survival. Some women who endured prison later turned their experiences into livelihoods. Accounts mention female ex-prisoners who served as informants for sheriffs, leveraging their knowledge of jails and fellow inmates. Others became vendors in markets near prisons, trading on familiarity with guards and routines. Though such lives were precarious, they represent a pragmatic form of survival, turning proximity to punishment into opportunity. Perhaps the most striking survivors were those who lived long enough for memory itself to soften judgment. Records from small villages show women once listed as prisoners later appearing in baptismal registers as godmothers, their earlier offenses seemingly forgotten. Time could erase suspicion, allowing survival to transform into quiet reintegration. These women did not become famous, but they endured in ways that mattered most. They remained present in their communities, refusing to be erased. Medieval prisons were designed to weaken, humiliate, and prepare women for punishments that often destroyed lives. Yet among the damp walls and rusted chains, some women survived through luck, faith, cunning, or sheer endurance. Their survival was rarely celebrated by contemporaries. But for us, it testifies to resilience that outlasted cruelty. In a world determined to use confinement as control, these women lived on, carrying scars but also stories that refused to be silenced. Another day in the cells. The rhythms of prison life in the Middle Ages rarely made their way into chronicles or legal records. Sentences were described, judgments written down, but the monotony of daily existence for women locked behind bars was considered too ordinary to record. Yet by piecing together scraps from jail accounts, clerical registers, and passing remarks in letters, we can glimpse what another day in the cells might have meant. It was a life defined less by dramatic events than by endless repetition, small humiliations, and the constant reminder of dependence. The day often began with noise. Jailers clanked keys, other prisoners stirred, and rats scurried in search of scraps. Light, if it entered at all, came through narrow slits high in the wall. For women in underground dungeons, dawn and dusk blurred into the same half-darkness. Meals were meager and unreliable. Accounts list bread, pottage, or thin ale, sometimes stretched across several days. A lucky prisoner might receive food from relatives or sympathetic neighbors, but many women survived on rations just large enough to keep them alive. Hunger became a permanent companion, dulling thought and magnifying despair. Tasks filled little of the day. Some prisons forced inmates to spin wool or sew garments for profit, but most jails lacked organization for such labor. Instead, women idled, talking with cellmates if they had them, or falling into silence if alone. Conversation offered brief escape, though it often circled back to the same themes. Innocence proclaimed, debts lamented, or fears of Judgment Day. The lack of activity turned time itself into punishment, every hour stretching without relief. Cleanliness was almost absent. Chamber pots overflowed, straw bedding rotted, and vermin thrived. Women with children suffered double, caring for infants in spaces where filth was constant. Complaints reached officials occasionally, but little changed. Some jail accounts record purchases of straw for bedding or soap for washing, yet these were exceptions. For most women, daily life meant learning to endure stench and grime as unavoidable companions. Social hierarchies shaped even this bleak routine. Wealthier prisoners bribed guards for better straw, lighter chains, or access to visitors. Poorer women lacked such options, their bodies more tightly bound and their food portions smaller. A widow with no resources might find herself entirely dependent on alms gathered at the prison gate, a practice known in some towns as crying the door. Survival hinged not only on endurance but also on the charity of strangers. Religion punctuated the days. though not always as comfort. Priests occasionally visited to hear confessions, administer last rites, or urge repentance. Some women clung to faith, reciting prayers in the darkness and treating their cells as involuntary cloisters. Others expressed bitterness, blaming God as much as men for their plight. Jail records describe women refusing confession out of anger, a form of resistance that unsettled clerics but underscored the toll of captivity on the soul. Conflict and companionship coexisted. In crowded cells, quarrels broke out over food, bedding, or space, yet bonds also formed. Letters from noble households describe ladies sending aid to female friends imprisoned for debt or scandal, gestures that sustained both body and spirit. Among poorer women, solidarity could take the form of shared scraps or whispered advice on facing trial. In a world where official compassion was scarce, the kindness of fellow prisoners sometimes made survival possible. Evenings brought little change. Guards locked doors, darkness deepened, and silence pressed close. Women tried to sleep on straw that scratched and stank, disturbed by coughs, sobs, or the restless movements of vermin. Dreams, when they came, often mirrored waking fears, the shame of public punishment, the grief of children left outside, the terror of never leaving the cell again. The true cruelty of another day in the cells lay not in spectacular torment, but in its grinding repetition. Nothing happened, and yet everything weighed upon the body and spirit. Hunger, filth, dependence, and uncertainty combined to erode strength in ways no single punishment could match. To live one day in such conditions was suffering. To endure weeks or months was survival against the odds. Medieval prisons were not designed for rehabilitation or even long-term detention. They were holding places, waiting rooms for judgment. Yet within their walls, women endured days that blurred together. Each one a small defeat for dignity and hope. Another day in the cells meant exactly that. Another day lost, another day endured, another day that left its mark long after release.